So next we have a very, one of our kind of most timely panels, which is panel discussion number 2 on COP26 and JETP, investing in decarbonization and energy transition. So I would like to call to the stage our panelists and moderators. First is Ms. Ha Do, Head of ESG Infrastructure, Government, Healthcare for KPMG Vietnam and Cambodia. Ms. Phương Mai Luong, Vice President of HSBC Vietnam. Mr. Tum Ho, Country Director of Allotrope Partners. And Ms. Hang Dao, co-lead of the Vietnam Clean Energy Investment Accelerator. Please come to the stage.
Good late morning, everyone, and to all the speakers. I understand that we're approaching lunch, and we're all looking forward to it, more networking. But I'm confident and to guarantee you that this panel won't make you feel more hungry. Instead, it will energize everyone because energy is what we're talking about here. And it's just energy, which means it should be accessible to everyone. So please join me to welcome our excellent speakers today. Ms. Ha Do, the head of ESG in Vietnam and Cambodia. She's also the head of governance, infrastructure, and healthcare in both countries. Ms. Mai Luong, the head of the large corporate South from HSBC Vietnam, and she has extensive experience in the commercial and real estate segment, actually. And sit next to me, Mr. Tung Ho, the country director of Allotrope Partners. Is a private equity consulting firm based out in California, but they have office and operating in Southeast Asia, including Vietnam. So I'd like to ask the title of this session. I'd like to spark the discussion with some numbers, as you might heard of. So we are Vietnam in the unprecedented energy transition, and there's a recent report I read from ADB indicated that the benefit of this net zero transition in Asia would be 5 times higher than the cost to invest in the mitigate the climate impacts. So that is very encouraging. And so we come down to the JETP, which is the Just Energy Transition Partnership for Vietnam. And it's really a concrete step, in our net zero path, as our Prime Minister commit to in COP26. So we like to hear from you, from your live business and from your experience. What do you think of this JETP? Can you name outstanding opportunities as well as the challenges or barriers that you see for Vietnam market? So this question is open for every speaker. Who wants to go first? Yeah, maybe chị Ha.
Thank you, Hằng. It's a very interesting question. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure it's a great honor for all of us here, the panelists, to be on the stage right now and discuss a very interesting topic on COP26 and the net zero ambitions of Vietnam. I'm sure that if we are talking about JETP, opportunities and risks, my fellow panelists will have a lot to share. I just, from my role, not just only at the ESG head, but also the head of the infrastructure, government and healthcare of Vietnam, Cambodia, whereby we work extensively with the clients in the energy sector like EVN, Petro Vietnam, and many independent power producers. I just share the view from what I see as the burning issues. So if we are talking about JETP, we all know that it is a 15.5 billion fund that is committed to be deployed over the next 3 to 5 years. And the interesting thing is the fund is committed for 2 parts, the public sector and the private sector. And the fund for the private sector is largely contingent on how the public sector move. Yeah. So in that context, let's talk about the opportunities and the risk. Opportunities, again, our fellow panelists will share more. I just want to touch on two things. The first one on opportunities is we all know that Vietnam is now facing a certain power shortage. We still have to import the power, and with the very, very strong, economic growth. Yeah, this year is slowed down, but that continuous strong economic growth, GDP growth, will put the pressure on the power shortage. And at the same time, another pressure is they have to go green. And the PDP 8 just issued, I think 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago, it said that Vietnam aimed to have a 40 gigawatt of the green renewable energy. So I think the first opportunity here is I'm talking about like for investors, for developers in the green energy. It is a huge, opportunity. And we are talking about not just only the solar, the rooftop, and the nearshore wind, the onshore wind that has been the focus for the last few years. But we talk about, offshore wind, more solar and large-scale solar farm. So yeah, there is huge opportunity for private sector to come in. Another opportunity, I'm talking from the public sector. We all know that, Vietnam actually is really need to be really speed up on their regulatory framework. Right, there are various issues still outstanding. And the question here is, with such a kind of funding, then the Vietnam government can come up, grab the opportunity, and spend and focus and develop the projects around regulatory framework. And we are talking about some very real burning issues here. For example, how about the mechanism for auction that has been talking about? How about the really robust regulatory framework for the direct PPA? A lot of our clients come to us and say that, we love to, invest a large-scale investment in Vietnam, but then, we are facing the commitment to our shareholders and investors that at least 50% of our power consumption will be green source. Without the direct PPA, you cannot achieve that. Yeah. So I think that the opportunity is using the fund and do a lot of things around the regulatory framework and capacity building. Similarly, for the risk, two risks. Whether the Vietnam government will really prepare and set up timely enough to introduce such a kind of regulations timely. Because without robust regulatory framework, investor will just still think and consider rather than really, spend the money on. And the second risk, I think that if there are a lot of investors in the region, I'm sure they will really, nod their head to agree with me, is the risk of implementation, the regulations, if, they are in place at the, provincial, level. Vietnam have a lot of good intention regulations, but when it comes down to the implementation, where the projects, the developers have to deal with that, whereby they meet a lot of issues. Yeah, so those are like two opportunity and two risks I just wish to mention. Yeah.
Many critical points you brought up, regulatory framework, barriers, but again, a lot of opportunities for the private investment, but also the implementation risk. Those are the things that I think every investors or developers should keep in mind. So if, we want to hear next any follow-up thoughts on that from the lender side.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so I think that the JETP involved the mobilization of private and public funds to bring Vietnam to transition away from fossil fuels, right? And as Prime Minister Chinh have made it pretty clear at COP26 in Glasgow that Vietnam would require external support to get there. And therefore, JETP is a very critical platform for the country to make known to the world about its aspiration and to realize this agenda. As a bank with more than 150 years in Vietnam, we see the opportunities being massive, right? But if I have to choose just two, right? Energy is clearly is number one, but renewable energy particularly. But it's also important not to forget that JETP not just about energy, right? So there's a lot of things, electrification, so on and so forth, that relate into the same scope of JETP, and therefore the second opportunities I will bring up is transportation. So energy and transportation is the top two emitting sectors for Vietnam, right? And therefore the opportunities we see there is massive. As towards the challenge, I would think for energy, clearly the bankability of the PPA, and for transportation is a pace of transition, which is in turn as a result of an absence of a regulatory push to convert into EV, right? And second is the limited availability of charging infrastructure. But we see a lot of opportunities in this whole transition scheme altogether.
Yeah, thank you. I really like the point you bring about transportation. Sorry for interrupting a bit, but I myself have a bike and commute in Ho Chi Minh City, living and working. So kind of proudly feel like I contribute to this transition. So I encourage you to to do the same. But really, transportation is really the untapped area in both investment and regulation that Vietnam pretty large behind compared to even other peer in Southeast Asia like Indonesia, right? So, what your thought of this?
I think firstly, thank you for your sharing from the lender's perspective and also from a end user and personal perspective. I guess as a small advisory firm on decarbonization in Vietnam, we have supported corporates on a non-profit basis via our work stream to find solutions. And hopefully I can share that perspective in terms of corporates trying to find solution to decarbonize via this process. So I think the technology out there is important. Firstly, I think we see a surge in rooftop solar in the year 2020 and a little bit of a slowdown in the 2 years following after. And that's because of the lack of framework that should be there for net metering. But recently, with the approval of the PTP8, there's a few lines in there that promotes captive use of solar. So I think the next stage for us is certainly solar plus storage. Having piloted ourselves the first distributed battery storage system in Saigon High-Tech Park, we understand how difficult it is, both in terms of the commercial viability and also in terms of the regulatory requirement or the lack thereof when it comes to this space. So hopefully in the near future with the JETP, the private catalytic funding will come to help corporates to take on solutions like solar plus storage in the near future. And I think secondly, I'll be very brief, that I think there's the power sector and then there's the energy sector. So we have not talked about thermal decarbonization. So many of the industry in Vietnam, like deep industrial sector like cement or steel, rooftop solar is not going to solve their problem because their energy demand is massive and they require more solutions like thermal decarbonizations and exactly how to make green steel or make green cement. So hopefully with blended finance vehicles similar to CFM, we can use not just DFI money but also philanthropic money to pilot technologies and projects and help to reduce the risk from lenders these first pilot projects and then eventually scale the solutions to the extent that corporates can take on the service or the technology at commercial more viable. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I'm very glad that you mentioned about the heat demand in the industry. I think this add up to Ms. My point about this transition is not just about energy. in energy we have electricity and heat demand, and it's somehow the thermal or the heat part is overlooked in the investment front as well as the in the implementation. It is there. Like I totally agree that the technology is there, the readiness is there for the technology, but we need some more kind of push to really deep decarbonize this, because it's not all about electricity in the transport or in the industry, because I know Tung has a lot of experience working with the RE developers as well as the large energy consumers. So this is really, we see as an opportunity, not the barriers for the investors, but how we can find a way to tap into it. So, so those are very, I think, very valid point that you all mentioned. So we've been discussing about the what of this, you know, the challenge and the barriers. So I like us to dive a little deeper on the how a bit, because let's get a bit more practical. So this JETP deal, we have 15.5 billion for the next 5 years, right? And practically, we know that the forecast, as well as in the PDP8, you know, just approved, saying we need $15 billion of investment annually for the energy system of Vietnam. You know, large part of it is for the energy generation part, and the other part is for the transmission. So, simple math, we have 15 billion deal for next 5 years, but we need the same amount for every year until the next 10 years. So the next simple question is how, right? How we can mobilize the private capital, because we know that IPG a commitment for 15 billion deal wouldn't be enough because the numbers show it. So I think we would really like to hear from your experience, your advice on how to mobilize this capital, you know, fast enough, because we cannot just sit and wait for 15 billion commitment from IPG just in the next 5 years. So maybe you want to hear first from you know, the one with the capital power in the
Happy to. Yeah. Okay. So I think, you know, from a lender perspective, when we look at financing clean energy and any infrastructure project, right? So two main elements that we will be looking for. The first one is the bankability, and the second is the mitigating of greenwashing risks, right? So on the bankability side, we, you know, our advice to the investors is please be prudent with your business case, right? So the business case you are showing to your lenders should be different with the business case you are selling to your investment committee, because we are care less about the upside risks, but we are all about the downside risks. And as of now, we see, you know, the bankability of the PPA is elephant in the room, right? So unless it is fixed, we still see the constraint in terms of capital, private capital into the renewable energy sector for Vietnam. The second piece is on the greenwashing risks, right? So, you know, it is something really hardwired to the global bank strategy like HSBC, whereby we need to make sure that every dollar that we spend or we finance, we need to ensure that we green-proof that investment, or, you know, or we know exactly the use of proceeds of those. And, you know, in many cases, because of this ESG-related topic is very much science-based, and in many cases it goes beyond the capacity and capabilities of a banker like us to evaluate, to monitor, to audit. And therefore, typically, we're looking for a third-party, competent, qualified kind of organization to help us to understand that. So when we come to a lender, please do bear in mind these two elements, just so that we can, you know, sing the same language as we go along.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up with that, you know, be prudent. So, because we are at ESG discussion, so what is your advice? Or also I want to hear from Chị Hà on this point. What is the material values of the E, specifically climate, that the investors or the company are looking at, or from the advisory perspective, what the metric they should be looking at, right?
Probably before Chị Hà start, maybe I just supplement the point I mentioned just now about be prudent with your business case, right? So, and about the downside case risks here. So, to us, when we look at the financial proposal, we will do a lot of sensitivity analysis. So, although we totally understand the excitement that you have with the investment, but do prepare to build in some more buffer in terms of sensitivity analysis in your business proposal when you send to the bank, be it curtailment risks, or be it O&M costs, be it in the hike in interest rate or the volatility in foreign exchange. All of that element will hit your bottom line. Please do build in some more buffer as you typically would do, just so that because eventually when it gets to our desk, we'll be doing that anyway. So better for you and us to be upfront about all of the risks that you can see in an investment project, and then we can see how we can mitigate that. That can be a common kind of brainstorming exercise, but at least be upfront about the risks.
Yeah. I wish to touch the first point on the material values, for the E, when we are talking about ESG from the investor perspective. Actually, we always, face the questions by our client, for example, investor, and when they decide to invest in, let's say, certain companies in Vietnam. And the question always around that, okay, what would be the indicators I need to use around that when I evaluate the companies? Then the first point we always would suggest is because a lot of those things, appear is hard to quantify, right? Then we suggest that you can start with the very standard one, that is the Sustainability Accounting Standard Board Management, because they focus on the 5 categories among like the environmental, the social capital, the human capital, the innovation model, and the governance. And from those 5 categories, they have, about like 30 universal category items that you can, let's say, base on, and that's whereby you can assess, on the target company. But that is more from, let's say, regulation or, let's say, standard perspective. From more practical perspective, I think that let us be very clear with each other that, and like what Chị Thảo from P&G mentioned earlier, that a lot of companies, or like majority of the companies in Vietnam still look at the financial profit as the key, performance indicator. And looking at the management and see like what is their vision, their long-term vision, how they view and assess the ESG, especially the environment impact on their day-to-day business is something I think that the investor can look at. Now, again, we as a KPMG has been in Vietnam for next year will be our 30 years. We have been fortunate that during the whole long journey, we have been working with a lot of state-owned companies, top 50 listed companies and private group. And we can see that in the last 2-3 years, we are very, very glad to see the change, in the, the view of the various leaderships, especially for private company. More and more, they not just only they set up the ESG committee, but they put various policies, and they see that sustainability is one of the key factors that will add huge contributor to their company value And because of that, they take various action. So again, I think that the investor look at how the company, their culture, their leadership, is a key point. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. I'd like to, follow up with that. You mentioned about the upfront about the risk, right? And be transparent about the risk. I could like to turn to Tung because you have a lot of experience working with the developers as well as the consumers, and also we know that you are leading the Greening the Banks initiative in Vietnam. So probably you will hear a lot about the concerns or the challenge that how to make it concretize the more intangible risk. So what do you see into some factors that could help to de-risk those investments, especially in the clean energy transaction? Right, if you could shed some light on that.
Thank you. I think I'd like to follow up on Shima and Chiha points about capacity and prudence in transactions. I think in Vietnam, having worked with banks, I think it's about time we move beyond the kind of green finance one-on-one training and workshop. And perhaps it's not the case for champion banks in ESG like HSBC, but in Vietnam, as of my last, study, only 2 banks actually issue sustainable loans or bonds framework, and that kind of framework usually have to be verified or second opinion by a third party. And I believe that we can have all the workshop that we want, but what's the key takeaway? And I think for transaction to actually happen on the ground, because we hear a lot of developers and corporates saying that you have all these events about banks going green, but where's the money? And the usual answer from banks in Vietnam is that we have a separate process doing ESG due diligence, which I think most clean energy developers in Vietnam would pass. Well, then the credits and the financial due diligence and commercial due diligence and legal, that is a separate things. And if you have the exact framework, like a sustainable loan framework or sustainable bond framework or anything similar that abide to the ICMA principles, then certainly I think you can combine and integrate these 2 lines of due diligences and give credits where it's due, and certainly with the right framework, and then your transactions, and then your accountability to banks investor. You can show that I have this framework, is verified. We're going to make this transaction, and within those 2 years, next 2 years, then the transaction will be verified as green or sustainable. That shows, trust, for the investor, and they can then make the right investment. So I think capacity building and also the actual result, outcome of that capacity building is key for Vietnam to perhaps see more transactions in clean energy or energy efficiencies, any kind of sustainability linked transaction is in the market.
Yeah,
Sure.
I like to add some comments on what Tung just shared. Thank you, Tung. It's just a really, really interesting point. And I just want to share a bit from our experience, because we have been acting as financial advisor in various renewable deals in the last few years. Now, let's us agree that since November 16, the very first time the Circular 11 issued by the Ministry of Industry and Trade, when the first time they introduced the PPA template for solar and the feed-in tariff for solar. Now, since then, we always talk about the PPA template because we cannot negotiate, and that's why it is not bankable. Yeah, and that has been raised in every single conference on energy, renewable energy I attend, in newspaper, everything. Now, despite of that, Vietnam actually, seen one of the top country in ASEAN in terms of renewable energy capacity installed in the last 5 years. Yeah, what does it mean? It means that the role of the Vietnamese banks, actually we cannot underestimate the role of the Vietnamese bank. they are actually already the big contributor for such success. So when I want to like make this point, because I want to leverage Tung's point is, so if we are talking about energy transition, whatever, don't estimate the role of the domestic banks. And you raise a beautiful point, Tung, that I mean all of the regulatory framework, the standard, we need to also really help and support the banks. And Mai Phương and I, we just have some chart before this panel, and we can see like for banks, our conversation were around for international banks in Vietnam. If you talk about green finance products, wow, they have a plenty readily to be implemented. Unfortunately, Vietnamese bank, that's not the case. 2 days ago, I met with the head of strategy of one of the top domestic banks in Vietnam. We got a very, open discussion about the green finance, and unfortunately, they are not ready. They even like at the very, very early stage. So come back to your point, how? Then the role of the financier, especially domestic bank, is very important in this, energy transition. Yeah.
Very, very valid point to the role of the financier. Talking of which, I'd like us to touch on the, because the JETP, we cannot, shy away the coal phasing out or coal phasing down or whatever you name it. It's an elephant in the room. Whenever it's small or big, it's still an elephant. So we know that it's not easy to early retire of the coal power plant in Vietnam, especially when it's very in a young age. So we really want to hear what is your take of the risk, who taking the risk, or how what kind of possible finance mechanism to do faster or to retire faster the coal power plant, or what kind of mechanism that we de-risk for the investment in those deals, because those questions we haven't really touched in the discussion in Vietnam or elsewhere, even in the country like Indonesia or South Africa, where they got 1 year ahead of Vietnam. But this is really a chance for us to brainstorm, bring some ideas and recommendation, even aspiration, though it might not be that fast, but we really love to hear your thought on that. Yeah.
So in December last year, HSBC at a global level announced our latest energy policy, whereby we would accelerate our investment in renewables and also phasing out from fossil fuel financing. And it means a couple of things, right? So number one, we commit or we target to reduce our on-balance sheet finance emission related to coal thermal power plant and thermal coal mining by 70% by 2030. We also recognize the role of natural gas that they can play in converting thermal coal power plant into a lower carbon kind of emission scenario. And we are willing to look at that financing of natural gas on the basis that that transition kind of thermal coal power plant would be net zero by 2035 in EU and OECD country, and 2040 in other country. And on the basis that the emitted methane from that natural gas fire process would be mitigated. We also evaluating our existing emitting client in power and utility basis on an annual basis, right? And that involve the conversation and the engagement with the client on transition plan. We will be asking them whether they have a transition plan in place. What option do they have? How can the bank help? What timeline that they help, right? And after so many engagement, if we don't reach an agreement as to where is the transition plan, where they are heading to, or their commitment is still very much misaligned with what we are expecting, then we have no choice to formally assess whether or not we'll be staying with the ongoing financing, right? But as an immediate start, we are no longer financing new development or kind of new advisory for new business in this sector. But one important thing we are mindful of though is in the countries, in developing countries like Vietnam or Indonesia, many of those are still reliant on coal-fired thermal power plant to power their economies. And therefore the just element will come into place, right? Whereby we are not talking about the switching pathway, but a transition pathway whereby we expect gradually phase out, and we do take into account the scenario of each country, and therefore, the phase out of the core financing and transition plan also pays out accordingly as we move from country to country.
A very interesting point you mentioned about, at least first we have to have a will and then a framework and concrete action plan, right, in order to really do the phasing out. Chị Hà, I know you have experience also, recently engaged with the state utilities like EVN and some corporate like PV Oil. So really want to hear from your experience what kind of direction or ideas or some recommendation or anything that we could bring in the table that maybe give some recommendation to those have the kind of a very big share in the coal-fired power plant and in fossil fuel business?
Yeah, thank you. And if there is anyone from the audience, from the international development agencies like World Bank or USAID or AFD or ADB in the audience, I would really love to hear their points and their input in this regard. Yeah, but just purely share from the KPMG perspective in our advisory experience, especially in our extensive working with Petro Vietnam and EVN. Then you know those are the two largest power and energy supply in the country. And since the Vietnam Prime Minister committed that Vietnam would become net zero by the 2050 in COP26, then those two large entities have been asked by the government also to come up with their energy transition roadmap. Yeah, and I understand that both of them are actually now working actively on their energy transition plan. But why I mentioned the international development agencies here, because we can see please don't forget the fact that Vietnam is still a developing country. And unlike Singapore, for example, where the Singapore government can, have a huge budget, to engage the advisor, etc., to come in and help them with a very clear and strategic plan on energy transition. Here, the Vietnam, we still need to rely a lot on the support from such a kind of international development agencies. Now, and the same for some countries in the region. Early retirement of coal is a very, very hot topic for Vietnam. Please, again, don't forget the fact that unlike European countries, whereby they have a 2 or 3% GDP growth per annum, we are talking about 6, 7, 8, and it has been continuous for the last 2 decades. Yeah, don't forget the fact that the large scale, power asset were added into the system in the period from 2000 to 2010 is much more than from 2010 to 2020. So we understand like ADB, for example, they already actually implement a project called early coal retirement to cover the 3 countries, Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam. Unfortunately, due to certain technical issues, that project has not yet started in Vietnam, but already started in Philippines and Indonesia. For Indonesia, they moved that fast that ADB also picked up another actually real project with Cybon, I think Cybon, CIREBON, power. I'm not sure whether I pronounce correctly, but that's the name, whereby they pick their, coal-fired plant and use it as example to do the coal phasing. So again, I think that the role of the and sorry, also to add that I understand recently, World Bank, AFD, and Australia Embassy actually have also, embarked on their journey with EVN to support EVN in its energy transition plan. So I think, leveraging those role is very important for Vietnam energy transition in general. Yeah.
Right. It's certainly we acknowledge the pressure that the guys like EVN or PVOI having under this transition. So that's why I want to turn to Chung about what did you see the role of the consumers. You're working a lot with the large corporate energy consumers and buyers, and in Vietnam, and again, re-emphasize, we are still developing country, and the industrial energy consumer, accounts for more than half of the electricity consumption of the nation. So they must have some voice or some demand on the energy transition. Can you shed some light on that?
Yes, and thank you, Chia and Jemai, for your sharing. So the coal retirement mechanism, or CRM, another acronym, I'm sorry, is a complex topic. And I think in other countries, there has been transactions to do this, to buy out coal plants in operations, perhaps late in its life or early. The problem with Vietnam is coal plants is very young in our country. It's less than 10 years old. And then for banks, a coal plant should operate for 25 years before it's considered a little bit, outdated, and there should be some refurbishment, though it can operate for more, about 34 years. So the question for Vietnam is how do we phase that out? And the corporates certainly want to clean the grids, for sure, to reduce the emissions. So I talk with my friends and NGOs in Korea and Japan, and they say like, hey, Tong, we are suing our government because they have coal plants in their pipeline.
Oh, that's
how about you do that?
Bold action.
And I'm like, perhaps that's not the right approach in Vietnam. What other options do you have?
Be friend, not foe.
And then, like recently, a deal in Philippines with AC Energy, where ADB facilitate this, I think, CRM prospect. So basically, they buy out the coal plants, mid-life, and then the debts, the money that comes in terms of concessional debts for AC Energy to reinvest in renewables. So basically, they pay them out for the plants, and then AC Energy can use that to develop renewables in the country. It's great. But AC Energy is a leader in the region in terms of renewables. A lot of elements have to be in place for that deal to happen. And I talk with the guys, like, can that kind of deal happen in Vietnam? They say that it's a little bit tougher because asset owners in Vietnam perhaps do not have the same capacity to transition from coal. I'm operating my coal plant, it's giving me good money. Why should I, put that into renewables when the grid is very, very, is not that great? Congestion, and curtailment. Why should I do so, right? So that kind of transaction in Vietnam is a little bit tough for now, and elements have to be in place, perhaps. So I think in terms of corporates, it's great to focus on, and from the private sector, it's good to focus on grid upgrades, for sure, to allow for more renewables to come up online, for more balancing mechanism, like grid balance, like in terms of short duration or long duration battery storage, combined with utility scale solar and wind, and hopefully with the right mechanism, and banks can provide that kind of capital to first, I think, integrate more renewables. Then I think we can talk about coal phase out once all the elements are in place. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, thank you. This discussion is really fantastic, and I've been enjoying a lot. I still have a lot of questions, by the way, but I want to give some time to the floor if you have a question. And if you can give the mic to the gentleman over there.
Cutting somewhat to the chase, the big problem with all this from an investor's perspective is what kind of rates of return we can get. So, being rather unkind but putting the lady from HSBC on the spot, if someone was actually going to fund a long-term project, one of the keys to that is clearly going to be raising debt to put some leverage into the deal. Assuming that you've got the, I can't remember how you described it, but let's say the profitability reasonably underwritten at today, and obviously I'm not asking you for a price commitment, but what would be a sort of long-term debt funding rate that you think would be acceptable at the moment?
Okay, before we get to the rate, I think it's important to identify the source of funding for the project, because some of the regulatory challenge in Vietnam when it gets to funding is number one, the VND debt in Vietnam cannot be refinanced. And number two, typically banks' appetite, commercial bank appetite will be surrounding 7 years, or for international bank probably even shorter. And there's no effective hedging mechanism for US dollar. But a lot of companies still opt for a balance between onshore and offshore funding. The offshore funding would enable you to refinance at maturity, or when you have a stabilized portfolio to refinance that altogether. And the cost is relatively lower. For onshore financing, local bank can go pretty long with the financing appetite, but the VND rate typically would be higher. So depend on your kind of funding source that you choose, then it will determine your cost base. I think, typical for project finance or long-term, in the absence of any credit enhancement, it can be in the range of 400 basis points over any base rate that you can have offshore. But the challenge for commercial bank is typically we will be requiring a kind of a credit export agency to go alongside, and then for us to take part of the commercial risks, but the ECA will support us to take some of the political related risks in which we are not in a position to assess or evaluate or mitigate ourselves. Then with the presence of ECA, it will significantly bring down the cost, and it would be able to crowd in a lot of private capital as well. So we have seen, with ECA financing, the kind of all-in cost can come from 400, 500 basis points over a base rate to 150 to below 200 basis points. So.
Right. The problem is with that is based on the sort of government tariffs they're talking around. I mean, if you come in at, so we're a US-funded, private US-funded organization, so we're actually looking for commercial rates of return. We're not interested in investing anything that will give me a lower rate of return than I can get in the US. That's just pointless. Why would I take the political risk? So then you look at green projects around here, and solar being a classic example, and you sit there going, well, the rates of return, well, I'll kind of cut through where you were, but just assume that you're going to be funding debt in local currency at, let's say, 10%. Yes, you might get it cheaper in US dollars, but then you've got the currency risk, so you're back to funding at least 10%. And the kind of income generation that you're seeing from government suggestions, should we call it, leave you with an equity return that's going to be pitiful. So I can totally understand that people want to pat themselves on the back and feel good, might want to invest in green projects in Vietnam, but as things currently stand, it makes no sense whatsoever for a private investor who actually has to talk to their shareholders and explain why they're getting pathetic returns or not invest, the more likely solution. Do you see any sense of genuine opportunity? I realize everyone wants lots of money, but is there any genuine opportunity to invest in renewable power in Vietnam? And sorry, just to clarify, a genuine opportunity is not that people want money. A genuine opportunity is people want money and are prepared to pay a return that private investors might be interested in.
Yeah, I think you raised an absolutely valid point about the return for an equity, right? And referring back to Ms. Ha's earlier point about the role of the local bank play, I think they have done pretty well in the first 3-4 years of the renewable journey in Vietnam. And we were lucky because of the interest rate environment in Vietnam during the past 4 or 5 years was historically low. Right? And then people were happy with the long-term financing and then, the level of acceptance of local banks, so on and so forth. But moving into the future, exactly to your point, I think the investor will need to secure every single cent in terms of cost to ensure they can make somewhat decent return. I don't think it's super sexy, but, just somewhat acceptable return. And it is kind of a long-term vision in Vietnam that investor can buy in. But they need to get their cost right. And they need to get the liquidity right. So to a certain point whereby the country will need extra power to move into the net zero by 2050, it would go beyond the capacity of local institutions from a lending capacity because we have limited lending capabilities, single borrower limits, so on and so forth. And therefore, unlocking the international funding is critical, both from a liquidity depth point of view and also from a costing point of view. Because international lenders will differentiate clearly between a greenfield development and brownfield development, and why probably you may be open to pay more when you are at a greenfield stage. You probably can save a hefty buck when you get to a brownfield or stabilized asset development stage. So I think, and in order to achieve that and to enable the investor to see that, hey, there's still some return and decent return and opportunity in this market, I think that source of capital needs to be unlocked. And in order to do that, I think the PPA need to be considered. I don't expect everything about the PPA to be fixed. And when people talk about the bankability of PPA, it can mean a lot of things. Termination right, lender step-in right, political force majeure, so on and so forth. But, and the lenders can always take a view and evaluate certain risks, but there's only one single risk that we struggle to evaluate and mitigate ourselves, which is the curtailment. So if I have only one ask for the government, please do fix the curtailment risk. The lenders can work it out for whatever it is, as well as the investors, right? And the private capital, be it from the investment side or from the lender side, are super nimble, right? So we don't need to guide them. They will flow whenever the opportunities are. But at least the curtailment risks, a hardcore under the PPA, need to be relooked at.
Right. Yeah. Thank you very much, both, for a very exciting exchange. Unfortunately, we run out of time, but I'm sure we have plenty more time in the networking lunch. I'd like to come back to our speakers to close the session by an act of calling for action. So we really want to hear your words of wisdom. Let's say, if you can name some immediate action, which is tangible or feasible for the stakeholders, either government, or private sector, or the bank, or the buyers, can take, to contribute to this transition. I mean, in the next 2 years, because our experience in Vietnam, something within 2 years, pretty quick, right? So we extra time, or the rest 3 or 2 years of the JETP. I'm asking because we want to make this conversation going on. This conference or network is just one and off, but next year or next 2 years, when we come back and sit together and see our recommendation or our ideas or aspiration, see how it's progressed. So 30 seconds for your words of wisdom.
Actually, already said that. It's a curtailment risk.
Okay, very good.
Only
word.
one thing.
So cut the curtailment risk, very valid point.
Strong political will and regulatory reform.
Very good.
In the short term, I think de-risking facility for banks that cover the first loss in the short term before we can tackle the PPAs, because that's going to take a while with the grid that we have right now. So any kind of mechanism that do so to cover the loss for the investor, that should be fine, whether that's a voluntary carbon market or any kind of blended finance vehicle. But, yeah.
Right, thank you very much. It is all well noted, because I'm not taking note, but others taking, and we'll see in next year or next 2 years. And again, I'd like to thank our speakers for their insights and very forward sharing. I'd like to conclude the session with a thought that, again, I would say we have ocean of opportunities in this transition and for the climate investment. Also, mountain of challenge and barriers, but yet if we don't act now or early, the consequence even more extreme. And if we don't feel it, but we should agree that this is the urgency of the climate crisis that we are all facing. So again, thank you all for contributing to this session. Enjoy your lunch.